You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.
Hello and welcome to News Talks, the Times Higher Education podcast in which we delve into the biggest stories in global higher ed. I'm Miranda Prynne, campus editor, and this week we're staying in the UK, where one of the first acts of the new Andy Burnham-led Labour government has been to announce the scrapping of the 3-year-old Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, or DSIT. This brief will now fall under the Business Secretary's remit in a merged Department for Business, Innovation, Science and Trade, with some of the tech elements being overseen by a new Minister for Artificial Intelligence. This decision has been met with mixed reactions across higher education and the tech industry, with the former desperately hoping for a more supportive environment under Burnham than they met with under Starmer. But not a great deal is known about Burnham's plans for higher education, certainly no specifics at this stage. We know that he worked closely with universities in Greater Manchester as mayor there and understands their value in supporting regional economies. But the scrapping of DSIT is really the first concrete move to indicate what direction of travel there may be. And so here with me to discuss the likely impact is our Times Higher Education features editor, Paul Jump. Hi, Paul. Thank you for coming on.
Hello, Miranda.
So first, a bit of history. The Department for Science, Innovation and Technology, or DSIT, as I'll now refer to it, was set up by Rishi Sunak in 2023. And prior to this, science and research had been lumped in with business and industry as part of the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, and that was since 2009. Clearly, there is a strong tie-up between research, the resulting innovation, and industry. So why was DSIT created in the first place? What was the thinking behind that?
Yeah, when you've been in higher education journalism long enough, you notice the same stories and rationales sort of coming round and round and then being discarded and then coming back again, thus proving that history, if it's not circular, is at least elliptical. But yeah, I mean, this is a good example of that. I mean, historically, both universities and science were all in the education department. But then it all started to get kind of shaken up under Gordon Brown, actually, when he came in 2007. He set up a separate department specifically for universities and science, which was called the Department for Innovation, Universities and Skills, DIUS. So again, the thinking there was that because universities were becoming so important to the economy and indeed research, they needed their own department. Sounds familiar, doesn't it? But that only lasted 2 years before that was rolled into the old business Department for Business, Innovation and Skills, which was set up by Brown in 2009 under a bloke called Peter Mandelson. I don't know if anyone remembers him. But that was his domain, and it sort of stuck there for quite a while through all the sort of difficult post-2008 years. But then, in 2016, finally they decided that higher education should go back to the education department. That then was split off from science. But initially it had the same minister, who was Joe Johnson, the Prime Minister's brother at the time. So he was straddling two departments. But eventually they sort of, the divorce was completed and science was completely separate from higher education, but still within the business department. And then, finally we get to DSIT in 2023. So why was it created? Well, according to the Downing Street press release at the time, I'll just read you a bit of that. It's not particularly inspiring prose, but here we go. It says the department will drive innovation that will deliver improved public services, create new and better paid jobs, and grow the economy. Having a single department focused on turning scientific and technical innovations into practical, applicable solutions to the challenges we face will help make sure the UK is the most innovative economy in the world. So it was all, it was at the time when the Tories were talking about Britain being a science superpower and drawing all the best researchers from around the world. So it's considered to to be proportionate to the scale of those ambitions that it would have its own department.
So lofty aspirations as ever when creating a new department. I mean, from everything you described there, it does sound like one of the major challenges faced by those in higher education and research more broadly is just that there's just been endless change in the last 15 years, and however far you wish to go back. While some departments are relatively stable and steady and maintain their brief, the areas into which higher education and research fall seem to be very much subject to a lot of change. And yes, as you say, I mean, clearly DSIT was meant to be responsible for driving forward the UK's science superpower ambitions through R&D support and investment. It also, of course, led on the digital transformation of public services and tech strategy, which has become very important, particularly since the sudden explosion of AI into everyone's lives. But while DSIT was created by Rishi, obviously it's lived out its final 2 years under Labour, with first Peter Kyle, then more recently Liz Kendall leading the department, and of course Patrick Vallance as Science Minister. And I wondered what agenda these three figures had pushed and perhaps what legacy they've left.
It's interesting. I mean, obviously, Vallance is a very different beast from the other two. He's non-political. He was obviously he became a bit of a household name during the COVID crisis when he was chief scientific advisor and appeared next to Boris Johnson every day on the TV. So he was quite a heavyweight appointment at the time, and quite a technocratic one as well. And was very much welcomed by the sector. The other two obviously are very much Labour figures, and I think it's fair to say that the agendas of them were quite different. I mean, Vallance is, unsurprisingly, was quite focused on the sort of traditional elements you'd expect him to be on regarding research policy, how UKRI was organised. For example, he was quite focused on what he called buckets, where he was dividing the budget into three separate buckets: one for pure research, one for applied research, and one for sort of supporting commercial spin-outs and that kind of thing. I mean, of course, UKRI's been doing that for decades, but I think it was partly about rebalancing the amount of money put in each, and partly about just making it clear to the government and to the public that significant amounts of money were in fact going towards applied research and commercialization, and wasn't just all going on scientists' pet projects. So yeah, he was focused on that. I think it's probably fair to say that Kyle and Kendall were less interested in that because they knew less about it, and they were much more focused on the tech stuff that you were just talking about, the AI agenda. And indeed, that was often a criticism of them, that they were accused of being focused on that, to the exclusion of pretty much everything else. I mean, The Guardian, for example, did a piece in May 2025 that they'd worked out that Kyle had 28 meetings with people in or close to big tech within the past 6 months. And that's specifically big tech as opposed to small tech. So the accusation was that he was focused on very much, the sort of very large American tech firms. Obviously, some people would say that's exactly what you need to be doing in that position, given that they absolutely dominate the market. But there was a criticism that he was, to some extent, in their pocket. And, that was the legacy that Kendall sort of inherited and, again, arguably continued. I mean, she denied to, for example, in select committee hearings that, she was obsessed with AI, but she did say that 2 of the 3 main policies were related to AI, transform with public services using it, and training the workforce in it. So yeah, I think they were very much focused on that. And it's interesting that obviously all of that AI stuff has now moved right into the centre of government in the sort of reformed cabinet office. So clearly Burnham himself takes that very seriously as well.
Yeah, and there's no doubt it is an area that needs a lot of focus. I think one can see why the feeling that the focus was all on sort of big tech, and big tech often, frankly, not based in the UK, did raise the odd eyebrow, because, of course, within that brief, if you're meant to be supporting innovation and UK-born growth, then possibly there needs to be a bit more room for small tech as well. I just wonder then, what are the key achievements of DSIT over its relatively short lifespan?
Well, yeah, good question. It hasn't had that much time to make an impact. I mean, within it were created certain things. For example, the AI Security Institute, which is there to sort of focused on the dangers of AI, and obviously that fed into the AI safety bill that we had not so long ago to mixed reviews, but nevertheless, clearly there are risks there that the government needs to focus on. It set up a sovereign AI fund, 500 million in venture capital. So if you're one of the firms that benefited from that, I'm sure you would think that was an achievement. Sort of closer to home, I suppose, for universities, it's more about the research budget. And it did secure a record budget in the last spending round, 86 billion over 4 years. So that's obviously not nothing, particularly, in constrained times. It has succeeded in making the government recognise how central science is to its growth agenda. And so in that respect, you might well say that having a separate department perhaps did help.
Yeah. DSIT, when it was created, was generally welcomed by higher education and the tech industry, as you say, as a recognition really of the vital role of science, research, innovation, tech in the UK's future growth and success. What, therefore, is the general sentiment now across higher education about the scrapping of DSIT in favour of emerging with business and industry?
Quite mixed, actually. I think what you pick up is that the scientists themselves are sort of quite wary of the closure of DSIT. I think there's a fear that if you put science back in the business department, that the brief sort of gets to some extent lost among other priorities, particularly under a minister that, unlike Vallance, probably doesn't know that much necessarily about exactly how research works, and therefore potentially has a bit less interest in it and sees it as a bit less of a priority. So that's one fear. Again, linked to that, if science and innovation is key to Britain's growth strategy, such that it is, then obviously, you don't want that brief to get lost in a bigger department. On the other hand, it is the business department, and if growth is to do with feeding science into business, you can see the rationale there, and that's, others have pointed that out. I think another big gripe from more the sort of wonky type people that obsess about the structures of government is just about how much time might be wasted through the sheer reorganization of a department and, moving everyone's desks and email addresses and all the rest of it. It does seem a lot of effort to be making at a time when clearly AI is, God knows how many iterations we'll have had of Anthropic just in the time it takes DSIT to move across Whitehall to the business department. So, there's an argument there that this is just the wrong time to be faffing about moving deck chairs on the ship's deck. But there are also those, though, that think DSIT deserved to die a death because it had become sort of swallowed up by the big tech people. And funnily enough, one of the people that thinks that is George Freeman, who was indeed the science minister, the first DSIT minister when it was set up by Sunak. So of all people, you'd expect him to be a supporter of it. But he said yesterday we need research and development embedded across the whole of our economy, government and foreign policy, not just an AI deep tech department focused on Google. So yeah, he very much sees it as having been captured to some extent by those it's supposed to regulate and what have you. And yeah, there is the counter argument as well in terms of science's power within government, that if it is within a bigger department, it does have more heft at the cabinet table. So, what you lose by having it diluted within a bigger budget, you gain by the fact that that bigger department has more heft at the cabinet table. So you can argue it both ways, but Greg Clark, for example, another former business secretary under the Tories, he was quite pleased that DSIT had died for this reason, and he actually made the point that it should swallow up universities again as well. So we should recreate the old biz department and take universities back from education, again on the grounds that you can't have research without universities, particularly in a country like Britain where research is very, very, very focused on universities.
Yeah, that's interesting. So he thinks universities as a whole should actually sit alongside business.
Yeah.
I mean, as you say, clearly there's not one dominating perspective on this. Actually, it's an interestingly mixed set of reactions, and there will be pros and cons to doing this. There are definitely a lot of concerns that this is a downgrading, if you like, of the importance of science and tech and innovation. However, Andy Burnham recently coined the term innovation nation, I guess his version of science superpower, and he certainly recognises the importance of research and innovation and higher education in underpinning economic success. So why might he have done this? What do we think his thinking is in forcing this fairly disruptive move at a time when energy and resources could be well used elsewhere?
I mean, it's a good question. I mean, all we really have to go on, as far as I can see, is there was an official statement from the Labour leader in the House of Lords yesterday, Angela Smith, who didn't say a great deal about the rationale, but she said this will align our science and research base directly with commercial application and job creation. So it is very much, that idea that if university research is going to be the fount of, economic growth, then it needs to be in the business department. So I think it's, as far as you can tell, it's just that commercial logic.
Yeah, and there are definitely many commentators who would say that government is too siloed and that a lot of things function better when they can be kind of held together under one brief. Who are the new ministers leading on science, innovation and tech, and what do we know about them?
At the time of recording on Wednesday afternoon, we don't know who the science minister is. We do know who the Secretary of State will be for the business department, and that's Jonathan Reynolds, who he was business secretary previously before Peter Kyle was promoted to that role out of the science role that Kyle had before. So he is a known quantity in that sense. He hasn't had a huge amount of sort of obvious impact on science policy itself. I think it's often the case, really, in the business department. It certainly was previously when science was in the business department, that really it's the science ministers themselves that tend to direct the science policy, whereas the Secretary of State tends to be focused on the other things, really, that Biz did. But, Reynolds was the one who launched Labour's industrial strategy in 2024, so he is very much on board with that and universities' role in it. So I wouldn't expect a sort of huge change in that regard. I mean, in terms of who else is involved, we don't really know. Various people have been, as we record, various people have been appointed to the Biz department, but we don't know what their actual roles are. There's a couple of parliamentary undersecretaries, Kate Dearden and Chris MacDonald, who've been appointed, but we don't know what their roles will be. Intriguingly, the Scottish Labour leader, Anna Sarwar, who he's not Scottish Labour leader anymore, but was, and was very much an opponent of Keir Starmer. He's stepped down from Scotland and has now been appointed in the Lords, and apparently is also joining the Biz department. So we might get him as well, you never know. But none of those names have obvious sort of science backgrounds or anything. So I think probably whoever it is, the sector will be a little bit nervous about. We're not going to get another Patrick Vallance, that's for sure. And then there's another guy, Kanishka Narayan, who was in DSIT overseeing AI, but he's now moved on to the sort of centralised AI role within the Cabinet Office. So yeah, he's also a sort of continuity candidate, but he's not in the Biz anymore.
I believe he's sort of straddling the two, isn't he? I think he's going to sort of work alongside the cabinet and the business department, as I understood it. But
so I think possibly various others as well. I mean, yeah. It sounds like quite a bitty role, but I think obviously the point there is that AI isn't just a science issue; it's an issue for every aspect of the economy in the country, really. So you have to centralise it. But yeah, sounds like a tricky role to me. But there we are.
Yes, agreed. Finally, what do you think, the likely implications for science and innovation in the UK when we consider, for instance, that DSIT was responsible for securing the UKRI budget, which they did a very good job of securing a very impressive budget for up to 2030. Might this be effective? Might there be a change in direction on other policies? For instance, some of the reforms that Vallance was trying to push through in terms of how research funding is allocated. What's the general feeling about this?
To be honest, I mean, my personal view is that actually it probably doesn't make much difference. Just moving civil servants probably doesn't make that much difference. Historically, it's striking that ever since 2010, when the coalition government came in, on the back of obviously a total financial meltdown in 2008, and non-protected government departments were being cut left, right, and centre. But even then, the science budget was largely protected. It was flat cash, so it didn't protect its value in real terms. But at the time, that was seen as an absolute triumph for David Willetts, the minister at the time. Of course, the quid pro quo was that the teaching grant disappeared and student loans were tripled. So if you're a student, you don't see that as a triumph, no doubt. But for science, which was fearing the worst at the time, it survived even that, while others fell by the wayside. I mean, you look at what's happened to the Justice Department, for example, or culture, media and sport. I mean, those have just been decimated over the last 15 years in terms of their budget. But science really hasn't. I mean, even in 2010, as I say, it was fine. Subsequently, it got reasonable budget settlements really wherever it sat in Whitehall. And I think, there has been a consistent recognition from all chancellors and prime ministers for all their failings over the last 15 years that, without science and without innovation, there really is little hope for Britain. And obviously, that's a view that's shared by most governments around the world. There is very much a consensus around that. So I'd say that the sort of fears that abolishing DSIT and moving the responsibility to a bigger department, I really rather doubt that it will have much effect on the budget. I think the big question really for Burnham about Burnham isn't that. It's about the devolution agenda, really, and what that might mean for science. If he's very serious about devolution, does that mean that some science funding gets devolved, and instead of funding scientific application purely on the basis of merit wherever they are located in the UK, which has been the traditional way of doing it, do you reserve a certain amount, certain proportion of it for Manchester or for Scotland or whatever? That will obviously have a huge effect on how science is funded and potentially where it's done, potentially what gets done. And that will be obviously hugely controversial, not least in the Golden Triangle, which would, in all likelihood, lose out in a situation like that, because you can't really see the rationale of doing something like that unless it involves a certain amount of redistribution of the money to other regions. It's a bit like the EU situation. I don't know if you remember a few months ago when we talked about that. There's always an argument in the EU about whether the EU science budget should all go on the basis of merit or whether certain amounts of it should go to countries that traditionally haven't done very well, particularly in Southern and Eastern Europe, on the basis that they're never going to improve if they don't get more money. And there could be a similar argument within the UK. And then the other question is how much of the science budget goes on pure versus applied research. The Vallance buckets question. Obviously, Vallance put a bit more in the applied buckets. Might Burnham put even more, or might whoever takes responsibility for the devolved science budgets, might they take the view that more of it should go in applied? I mean, that seems likely to me, that if you devolve a science budget to people who are very locally focused, their focus is unlikely to be on winning Nobel Prizes from their local area. It's much more likely to be economic growth, and that there's a natural push there towards applied research, even if you can argue that that's actually not a good approach, even economically. I think politicians are always pushed in that direction. So I think that's where the questions lie about science funding in the next 5 years or so.
Yeah, given, as you say, Burnham's real focus on devolution and wanting to see regional growth and wanting to help regional economies thrive, if you follow the logical step from that to the fact that pretty much every government, even post-recession, when we were seeing huge cuts across government, have always recognised that science and research and innovation are absolutely core to economic growth. if that's what you believe and you want to really support regional economic growth, then it doesn't seem like a mad idea that you would try and redirect certain amounts of funding and support based on geography alongside the basic merit of the research itself. But as you say, I mean, that would be a major shake-up of what we currently have in place. I mean, in broader terms, let's hope the optimists are proven right on this one, and that bringing together science and research with business and industry does give greater weight to the arguments for a strong research system. The current budget for research and development up to 2030 of 86 billion secured by Vallance offers a pretty robust starting point, even if we do see some policies and priorities being revised. Paul, thank you so much for joining me and talking through this today.
Good to speak to you.
And that's it for this week. You can find many more episodes of News Talks covering everything from university mergers to freedom of speech rows at timeshighereducation.com/podcasts. If you enjoyed this episode, please do like, share, or subscribe, and we will be back with you in a couple of weeks. Thank you. Bye-bye.
You're listening to a Times Higher Education podcast.